I was born in Sierra Leone, West Africa, and during the time of my birth, my country was going through a civil war. And prior to my birth, the war had been going on for like 10 years, and it wasn't until a few years before I was born that the war actually took a turn for the worse. The war started when Charles Taylor, who was kind of a terrorist, he came into the country, and together he and RUF joined forces, and they would go into the villages. They'd capture the little boys from like 9 to 18. They'd bring them back to their concentration camps where they would brainwash them and train them up to be soldiers, and then send them back out to enslave their family and kill them. So I grew up in a small village. I don't actually remember the name of the village, but I remember it was small, and the house I lived in was like a metal hut. We shared it with another family who had 2 daughters, and at that time it was just my mom, my father, and me, and I think my baby sister. Some of my memories blur together, but I think she was there. Before my brother Soros was born, I had a baby sister, and her name was Geneva. She was a newborn. She didn't make it. It's actually one of my most vivid memories. It was the day I realized that she died. I had stayed at a friend's house all day, and when we were coming back, I saw my mom sitting on a big stone, and some of the women of the village around her, and they were comforting her, and she was crying, and I knew something was wrong because I never saw Geneva without my mom. If it was my mom, there was Geneva. If it was Geneva, there was my mom. And so seeing my mom there and she wasn't holding her, I knew something was wrong. And I remember going up to her and I'd ask her, "Where's Geneva? Mommy, where's Geneva?" And she would cry. She wouldn't answer me. And standing a few feet away was my father. And there were a few men behind him with shovels, and he was holding this mat. It was rolled up, and he was clutching it to his chest. And I remember asking him, "Where's Geneva?" And he told me to stay put, and he and the men went around the hut, and they were gone for a little while. And when he came back, the mat was empty, and I just remember realizing that my sister was gone. See, at a young age, I knew what the concept of death was. I knew what it meant when somebody died. And it was because during the war, which was still going on, but from what I had seen from a younger age, of children dying and the rebels coming into villages and destroying them, and physically being there, I just remember realizing that Geneva was gone and that she wasn't coming back. And that's not the only memory I have. I have a memory of children being used as target practice. The rebels would take them and they'd tie them up to trees and they'd shoot them. And to terrorize the people and to keep them in check, they would go into villages and they would take men, women, and children, and they'd make you kneel on a table and put your arms up, and they'd tell you, "Do you want long sleeves or do you want short sleeves?" And if you said you wanted long sleeve, they'd cut your arm off at the wrist. And if you said you wanted short sleeve, they'd cut your arm off at the elbow. Because it was their way of causing fear. It was shortly after my mom died and my brother was born, that my father put us both in the orphanage. He couldn't provide for us anymore. And every once in a while he'd come and visit us, but it was rarely. And when he did, though, he'd bring us food. However, Soros and I would never actually get to eat it, because in an orphanage with 50 plus something kids who are fighting for survival, we hardly had any food. And when somebody did bring food, it was a fight to the death. So even though it was ours, the kids would steal it from us. We were some of the youngest kids in the orphanage. Soros was, I think, the second youngest, and I was like the sixth youngest, I think. So we were very small. I was 4, and and he was like 1. And even the orphanage wasn't a good place. It was a place of temporary safety. It had big walls that surrounded it with the big gate to keep out the rebels, but they would abuse us a lot over the tiniest things. If we got our clothes dirty, they would whip us. And what they do is they'd send one of the older boys out to climb up a tree and to break a flimsy branch, and they'd skin it, and then they'd whip you. Sometimes they'd whip you naked. Then other times they'd use a belt. If you lied, they'd whip you. Or they would take you outside. They'd sit you down on the concrete, and they'd have you put your legs in front of you and have you raise up one leg and both your arms. And they tell you to hold it. And if you put down any of your limbs, they'd whip you. And because I was one of the youngest, a lot of times the older kids would pin the blame on me. But it wasn't just me, it was a lot of the younger kids. And then the boys. The boys were especially abusive. The older kids, they'd shove me around and make up lies, and then at night they'd come into the room. They'd pick me up and bring me out into the hall, and they'd rape me. But it wasn't just me. They did it to many other girls. And it wasn't just them either. It was some of the staff, specifically our one staff member who was in charge of sewing together our clothes and going out and buying material. He'd pull me aside and bring me into a room, and he'd tell me it's a secret. He'd say, keep the secret. And he threatened me. Said that if I didn't, he'd come into my room at night and kill me. Now, I didn't exactly know what was going on. I was too young to comprehend anything, but it's like a feeling you get when you just know something's not right, and I felt that way. And it wasn't until I was older that I understood what it was. And I remember at 13 coming to my mom and crying and telling her what had happened. And to this day, it makes me feel so disgusting. Because I felt like something was ripped out of me, something that I can never get back. And it's hard because it messed me up so much. It messed me up so much. I went into this deep state of depression where I felt like I wasn't at peace, and I felt I hated being alive. I hated living. I hated breathing. And so at night, I'd go downstairs and I'd grab a knife and I'd come back up to my room and I'd just hold it to my chest. And I counted 3, 1, 2, 3. But I could never bring myself to do it, because the fear of death, everything that I had been through before the adoption, everything, it would just all come back, and it'd make me so afraid. And I remember God would talk to me. He'd say, why? I saved you from that. I put you in a loving family who loves you. I gave you new parents who were taking care of you. Why would you want to do that? And I remember that would make it go away. But I struggled with it for so long. But I was really good at hiding it. Nobody knew. Not even my parents. Now I'm healed. So, in the orphanage, anytime parents would come to adopt, we would do these big celebrations. They'd kill a chicken, and us kids liked to watch because it was funny watching them chase the chicken around to catch it and then to kill it. But they'd kill a chicken. They'd make this delicious like fried chicken and rice, and they dress us up very nicely, and we would welcome the new parents, and they'd introduce the new kids to the parents, and then about 4 or 5 days later we'd say goodbye. And I remember when Mama Binta and Papa Henry came up to me and they said, Kari, you're getting new parents. And for me, because I didn't understand what adoption was, I'd just see a bunch of white people come in, take the kids and leave, and I'd never see them again. So when they said, you're getting new parents, I was scared. I didn't know what to expect. So I was just kind of like, yay. And I remember the night that my parents came. I remember the gates opened. They had dressed us kids up really nice, and they had put us in a line, and we were singing one of our songs called We Welcome Our Guests. And I remember watching the cab roll in, and my mother stepped out, and then my father and their friend. And after we were done singing, I remember Mama Binta pushing me forward, and she said, these are your new parents. And I remember my mom kneeling down in front of me, and she was, hi, Kari, I'm your mom. I'm your new mom. And she handed me this teddy bear. And later that night, when the adults were talking and the kids had gone inside watching one of our favorite movies, my mom held me in her arms, and I remember falling asleep on her chest, and I remember just feeling safe. And another one of my good memories was they had took us out to look for ginger. They had given us these shovels, and I remember we had to dig for it, and then we had to really like cut the roots, and I remember that was fun. We had no food, hardly any water. What we had for breakfast was a small roll with butter on it and tea. And then for lunch, we'd have either batata leaves, casada leaves, or groundnut stew. And they would give us very small portions. And out of that small portion, we'd have to cut it in half and eat one half for lunch and then the other half for dinner. And then there were some nights we had no food, and we'd go days without food, and we'd become so desperate that they'd take these big trays and they'd fill it up with salt, and they'd feed it to us, and we were so hungry that we would just consume it. And I remember the pain of my cheeks swelling up, and just remembering that it hurt, and being so thirsty afterwards. But then we didn't have any water either. The water truck would come like every like once a month, because we had this outdoor water tank, and the water was brown and it had bugs in it. Because I remember the kids and I would come up to the ledge, look over, and we'd see like little beetles swimming around in it, and we just kind of laugh without realizing like that's going inside our bodies, you know. And because of that, when my brother and I were adopted, we came home with many parasites, and he had hepatitis C, I think, and I had an ear infection. When my parents got to the orphanage, everything was different. You know, my father brought his guitar, and so he'd play outside, and as kids would love it. My mom would stand by and watch. And as kids would teach him how to play the djembe, you know, we'd show him like, oh, this is drum, you hit it like this. We had very broken English because we didn't know English, and even though we had school twice a day, it was to learn how to read, and well, not read, but how to write. You know, school was to learn how to write, how to hold a pencil, how to draw, you know, how to make lines. And so we didn't know how to speak it. And I remember they brought toys, and the kids just loved it, because it wasn't very often that we got special things like that. It was very rare. The story of my life is something I can't explain. There's so many aspects of my life that has shaped me into who I am today, has made me the young woman I am today. You know, I'm alive, and the fact that I'm alive bewilders me. I should be dead. My brother and I shouldn't be alive. When we were adopted, Sorius was dying. He spent 2 weeks in the hospital. And there were so many times I should have died, you know, between the war and between the orphanage. We had caught malaria, which is this deadly disease carried around by mosquitoes, like hundreds of times. You know, there were times when the rebels had come into my my village, and they had taken me, and I remember I was stabbed in the hip. I still have the scar for it now. One of my most vivid memories was actually when I was, I think, 10 months old. It was nighttime, and the rebels had come in our village, and they had taken us out of our huts, and they made us all stand in a circle. And there was this one man that they chose, and there were 3 of them, 3 rebels, and 2 of them were holding the man up by his arms, and the third one was walking around, and he was saying, "This is what happens when you break the rules. This is what happens when you don't listen." And he stepped away from the man, and he held up his gun and shot him. I remember the sound of the gun going off and the sound of his body hitting the floor. I have a lot of memories like that. People dying. Specifically, one of my memories, I forgot what I was hiding under, but I was hidden under something. And I remember outside, you know, there were people screaming, and I remember the sound of footsteps, and I remember physically feeling everything shake, and my body was shaking, and I was crying, and I remember crawling out from under my hiding place and going outside, and I remember just seeing dozens of bodies lying all over the floor, and some of them were like in a puddle of their own blood. Some of them were in pieces. And I remember just standing there and seeing, and I remember crying. And beside me, there was other people there. The war tore my country apart. You know, I remember seeing buildings on fire and being in the middle of it, and the fact that I'm alive today. When I think about that, I can't help but praise the Lord. You know, because He plucked me out of that. He saved me. And even though after that it was a struggle, you know, with my chronic PTSD and having to face all these flashbacks and everything, I just could not be any more thankful for the life I have, for the people God has put in my life, for my loving parents, for my family, for my friends, even for my school. Everything has shaped me into who I am today, and I've healed. I'm healing.